Just going to ask you to take a step back for a few moments and think about science and the media from a completely different perspective. And I want to just start by saying that perspective begins with one understanding. You may be talking about science and the media at a time disjointed from the reality facing most journalists, and that is that we are living through an historic disruption of the way storytelling and journalism operates in the modern world. And that's my life's work at the moment, is understanding how what we call now new media, which will become just the media in a couple of years, impacts the way we see our world. And to some extent, paraphrasing Alexander, I'm someone who believes that journalism is far too important to leave it just to journalists. My job as CEO of a tech startup, is the way I see myself, and a journalist, is to try and persuade a new generation of journalists to embrace the power of social media to change our world. And I'm someone who's obsessed with innovation and change. And part of my problem is every time I try to explain to a fellow journalist or to somebody who's interested in social media how it works, I kind of find like it's trying to teach a child to tie their own shoelaces. You can't say it in spoken word. You can't write it down. You have to show. And I was just thinking about how I could illustrate what I think is the power of social media, the way in which it's changed human behavior, and what we need to understand to embrace it, with one example of a tweet sent 3 days ago. So if you just take a look, if I can maybe pop up on the screen there, it's an image. It's a twit pic, as they call it. It's a half-eaten apple floating, I think, 330 kilometers above the Earth on the International Space Station. It was sent by an astronaut called Chris Hadfield, who I would recommend you follow on Twitter, at Chris_Hadfield. And he says in the tweet attached to that photograph, he says, "Eating my fresh green apple, a rare and tasty treat in space. I wonder who picked it, where, and if they know." And it's just such a beautiful image and a set of words attached to it. And for me, when I saw this, and I see these images all the time in my job as head of Storyful, we basically take these remarkable images and pass them on to news organizations. And before I did, I thought this just illustrates to me 3 of the essential principles of how the social web is changing the way we describe our world. And the first one was, there's no mediation here between myself and Chris Hadfield sitting there in the International Space Station. I did not consume this through a newspaper, through television. There's nothing standing between me and the astronaut up in space. I literally consumed that firsthand from a first-person witness to something absolutely remarkable. And the second thing I realized was that the technology is not the issue here. You know, the amazing technology it requires to send that man into space and to allow him to have the communications equipment to talk to me on the ground, that's not the issue here. The issue is he spoke with a humanity that connected with me immediately, bypassing all the technology. And when you think about what he's doing here as well, the currency here is not the fact that he's a commander, or that he's trained by the US Air Force, or that he has a science background. It's the fact that he's speaking as a human being. He's asking questions about, an existential reality in 140 characters. He's communicating in a way that stresses the currency of the new media, which is authenticity. That's what's valued, not power or status, but authenticity, to be connected to the person who has the clearest view of reality. And so I just pop this up here because I think it does explain to me, well, first of all, why I got into this area, why I gave up a job. I was a foreign correspondent for 20 years. I used to protest in the front square outside here, this exam hall. I was leader of the Students' Union, a student activist. I was obsessed with change since I was 4 years old, and I think journalism for me was the natural career path when I left Trinity College, to go into an area where I could see change up close. So for about 20 years, whenever there was a disaster, an election, there was some sort of war or conflict, I was sent to report on it. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I began to experience a feeling of, angst about the lack of authenticity of what I was doing to describe events like the war in Iraq, the conflict in Afghanistan, the tsunami in the Pacific, in the Asian tsunami of 2005. And I remember using words like, words cannot describe. Words could describe, it's just TV as a medium couldn't. And along came the rise of, remember, it's only 7 or 8 years ago when YouTube came on the scene. And suddenly I was seeing things like the Obama campaign came along in 2008. I was lucky enough to cover that campaign. And I watched how he bypassed traditional media. His campaign liberated millions of people to go and organize for themselves. He made a speech about race in America at one point, viewed by 13 million people on YouTube, bigger audience than the CBS Evening News. And I realized this would change. Social media had given this political campaign of change the capacity to bypass the media. That was a scary thought as a journalist. Even scarier was about 2 years later. In fact, a year later in Iran, there was an aborted revolution against a disputed election, and it was recorded by 17 and 18-year-olds out in the streets with their camera phones, not by foreign correspondents like me. And I realized now suddenly everybody had the chance to be an observer, a professional observer to an extent, a producer, a publisher, a broadcaster. And that changed the game completely for me as a journalist. And the biggest problem clearly was, well, if everybody has the chance to tell a story directly to you, who do you listen to? When there's 72 hours of YouTube video uploaded every single minute, how do you find the story you should listen to or the video you should see? So I set up what I thought would be, and I think is now, the first social media news agency. We worked on the principle that if I broke down everything about a news organization, left the old bits behind and took the new bits on board, what would it look like? And 3 years later, our news agency works with the biggest news organizations in the world, the New York Times and ABC among our first clients. We work with other news agencies like Reuters, and we also work with the big social networks themselves. We work directly with YouTube to try filter the most compelling and newsworthy content emerging on those platforms. And at its heart, it is about technology. I am obsessed with technology as a journalist, which is a rare thing, but we are lucky enough to be in a city, in a country in Ireland, that is, to many extents, a leading location for the analysis of data. So we work in the principle that every news event creates a community. Because if you're looking at Tahrir Square or Aleppo in Syria, you're looking for the people in that area that are talking on social platforms, and you're listening to them and seeing the influencers. And remember that every community creates a conversation, and every conversation becomes a data set. It becomes words and numbers and images, and you can analyze that data set to give you a sense of authenticity and who you should trust and who you should listen to. And so we've worked with universities in Ireland. We're very proud to have worked with Trinity here, with UCD, the NDRC, Derry out on the west coast of Ireland and Galway. And also the Irish government has come to our aid, matching funds. You can imagine what it was like to be trying to raise €1 million in Ireland in the middle of the economic crisis for a media organisation based on no business model. The government came to help us. The importance of state support for innovation and technology, I'm living proof of that. I wouldn't be here today if it were not for that. So as a CEO of an organisation like ours, technology was critical. Innovation was in our DNA. It has to be. But it's not sufficient. Because we realised that technology is nothing unless you can harness the human behaviour that itself was created by the technology. 25 years ago, I sat in an office just across the square with my first Macintosh computer. I never forget it as a student journalist. The feeling of being on a computer, a device that could help me set a page. And 25 years later now, I'm leading a company that is literally every day finding, verifying and delivering the most compelling newsworthy content on YouTube, but the same principle still applies. Human judgment, the skill of a journalist, of a storyteller. And so for that reason, I would say human intervention is so critically important. And this applies, I believe, to science. And I think it's one of the things I've been listening to, and it's a common theme that happens when we start talking about social media, is that we get so scared and fearful of this chaotic, noisy environment in which everybody's an expert and nobody's an expert, that we just get paralyzed. And I'm just going to give you two or three just pointers of how I learned to love the social web and embrace it. And the first one was to understand that when we're talking about human beings, we have to understand that we're not listening to the entire conversation out there, the 72 hours of video. We're not looking for the wisdom of the crowd. There is no wisdom in a huge crowd, but there is wisdom in the crowd. And it may be a tiny proportion of all those speaking, but if all you could listen to is 0.00001% of all the people active on Twitter every day, that's a lot of people with a lot of expertise. And if you can harness that power where this crowd craves expertise, it craves trust, it craves authenticity. And if you can find those people in the crowd who can serve that expertise and that trust and authenticity, then you start to have something which has revolutionary power. Finding the wisdom in the crowd. The person in Aleppo who's telling me what's happening, the person who understands the difference between an accent in Aleppo and Damascus, the person who is the influencer within a crowd and a conversation. And these are the people that are our natural allies. I think, actually, in this age when we have such a democratic media force at work, that people are craving a new intelligentsia. They're craving a set of people who are experts by their authentic knowledge, by their proximity to innovation and change and events that are causing change. And I believe that this is your challenge. Have you got the understanding of these new powers to be that engaged intelligentsia that can bring to us the innovation and the change that is impacting our world? And I think I will not underestimate the huge problems here. We have the internet, the greatest machine to spread hoax that humanity has ever created, and yet you look at Twitter, it is the best fact-checking machine I've ever seen in my life as a journalist, because it can harness that wisdom in the crowd. So we have massive challenges. They are huge. We're in Trinity College. Let me quote Sam Beckett when he said, ever tried, ever failed? No matter. Try again, fail better. And I think I always think about that quote for myself as an Irishman, very proud to come from Trinity College. But it guides me along the way, because we are going to make massive mistakes as we move forward. My industry gave away content at the very beginning of the internet age. It was a big mistake, because people will pay information, as Paul says. They will pay for the right information. They will respect authenticity and people who have knowledge, and people who earn their trust. But they will not respect labels. They no longer are interested in status or power. They have a different currency, and that is trust, authenticity, and you have to earn that. The idea of the three letters PhD up against OMG and FWTF and all the other acronyms, they matter not. The only thing that matters for a new engaged intelligentsia, and I include in that journalists, is to make sure that you develop trust and authenticity. And when you're speaking about your experiences on the space station, you're doing it in a way that shows a half-eaten apple, not a dashboard or an equation. So I would leave you there. One last thing I would say as well is don't get obsessed with the technology. I think many of you will be uncomfortable with some of the devices and the apps and get overwhelmed by all the things that are on offer. But I look at my child, and I think this is a really good example. She's obsessed at the moment by Roald Dahl. And she has her own iPad, which she stole off me last year. I had to just give it up. And I look at her, and I realize how much we're entering the age of discovery. No longer search. We used to search for things. She just discovers things. She's very happy to go down rabbit holes on the social web to find out things about the everlasting gobstopper in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. And she's quite tactile on the internet, I realize. She no longer taps away in a computer. She doesn't need that literacy. She's tactile. She wipes, and she just has everything in her hands, and it's just such an easy connection. She treats that iPad as if it were a limb. And I start to think to myself how technology has changed in her vision. It no longer exists. It's just part of her life. And I think I take from my 7-year-old daughter a great lesson. Forget about the technology. Forget about the things that we get obsessed by, like the great uncertainty principle. Forget the actual object, or just think about the momentum. And that's the most important thing when we think about how to embrace this power, this new media, to better describe the world around us. Just remember, it's about the human behavior and not the things, the box it comes in. Thank you.